Okay, we're going to talk about the Second World War. I'm going to give a little bit of a lead-in to the Second World War by describing the establishment of the Soviet Union. Russia has been a society that we haven't really discussed in great detail. Russia will be extraordinarily important for the 20th century. This is the century in which Russian history, Russia as a dominant power, kind of comes into its own. So we need to take a look at the establishment of the Soviet Union, the revolution, just briefly. Okay, so the Russian government was headed by a Tsar. That's Russian for Caesar, just as Kaiser is German for Caesar. Right? This idea that that Russia was a quote-unquote third Rome, that the Roman Empire in the West had fallen, the Roman Empire in Constantinople had fallen, that the Roman Empire in Moscow would not fall, right? Or St. Petersburg would not fall. That the Tsar as head of the Russian people, the Russian Empire, would remain a guardian of kind of decency, morality, justice for all time. That's the belief system behind the establishment of this kind of autocracy. And it was an autocracy. This is a society in which the Tsars had absolute power. Serfdom, if you recall when we talked about communism, the communist mode of production and the establishment of serfdom. Serfdom was abolished in Russia in the 1860s, around the same time that the United States abolished slavery. Russia abolished serfdom. So in the Russian political system, the Tsar held a great amount of traditional power that monarchs in the West had prior to the French Revolution. There was no revolutionary movement in Russia of any significant size prior to the 20th century. The Tsar was chosen by God to rule Russia, according to the Russian Orthodox Church and the political system at the time. Now, Nicholas II was the last Tsar of Russia. And Nicholas was by no means a bad man. He was a very good man. He was a very committed husband and father. He cared very much for his children. If you've ever seen a Fabergé egg, one of those eggs that is made out of porcelain, that's gilded with gold and diamonds, and some of these eggs are millions of dollars in cost now. He had these exorbitant creations produced to please his daughters, cousins, etc. He cared very much for his children. He preferred to spend time with them whenever possible. The problem with Nicholas was that he was not a good leader. He did not have a good sense as to how much danger the monarchy was in and just how much his people were suffering. He couldn't think flexibly enough and be open-minded enough to recognize that everything was crumbling around him. He would prefer to isolate himself with the Tsarina and with his children. Nicholas left on 1915 to supervise Russian forces in the First World War, and this was disastrous. He did not have much military experience. The commanders who did have military experience at the front were flabbergasted by this because they suddenly had to obey a leader whom they felt should remain at home. This is the equivalent of the president going to the ground in Iraq and saying, well, you know, I'm going to dictate everything down to a small detail, even though, you know, the last 3 presidents we've had, none of them served active duty in any military unit, right? So they don't have a lot of experience. Certainly were not, unlike, say, Eisenhower or some general turned soldier, Eisenhower, Ulysses S. Grant, etc. And so they've preferred to leave a lot of the details to the generals and prefer to form the strategy themselves, not the details. Well, Nicholas wanted to control the details. And when he got there, he did a horrible job. Russian soldiers their equipment was horribly outdated. There were not enough rifles for Russian soldiers to use, and that's a problem in the Second World War also. And remember, we were talking about trench warfare with the machine guns, poison gas. You had Russian soldiers charging German machine gun nests on horseback, some of them armed with actual lances, these big long spears that horsemen would wield. And this is just, it's completely anachronistic, and Russian soldiers were being killed by the thousands, and it was in part due to Nicholas' poor leadership. And of course, it's not as though he wanted them to die. He was not an evil man, but he was just out of his element. The pressures of leadership were too much for him. People began to blame the Tsar for some of the heavy losses. These poor Russian peasants who could barely grow enough potatoes to feed themselves. And if you can imagine what it would be like to night after night after night, about 60% of your calories from potatoes, including the liquor that you drink, the form of vodka. Right? This is how peasants were having to cope with rough conditions. And of course, their sons, brothers, fathers going off by the dozens, being killed, and entire villages being depopulated of men. And we know the conditions of the First World War. We talked about that last week. So the Tsar took the blame for this. And on top of that, the Tsarina, Alexandra, developed a friendship with a very, very popular in one sense, but unpopular in another, a very, very dangerous character, that of Rasputin. Rasputin had been a wandering kind of monk, sort of a wandering priest. He had gained a cult following because it was believed that he had psychic powers, that he could heal the sick, that he could perform miracles, and of course he himself was anything but pious. So the establishment of the church, the Russian church, actually hated Rasputin because he was part of an underground sect in which the idea was that to overcome sin, the way that you overcome sin is by indulging in it, right? You don't resist it, you indulge in it. So there would be massive orgies and all these, opium and alcohol. The idea is that if you indulge in this, you become free from sin. Well, Rasputin developed a friendship with the Tsarina, and while the Tsar was away at the front, she actually allowed Rasputin to have a say in policy. And this infuriated the other members of the aristocracy, the dukes, the counts, the grand dukes, etc. They could not stand the fact that this guy with this huge beard, this horsehair shirt, walking around in their vicinity, telling them about policy, telling them about military leadership, even though, of course, he had never been in the military. And, of course, the people reading in the newspapers, in underground newspapers, about scandals involving Rasputin, that he was sleeping with large numbers of women in the palace, that he was manipulating the Tsarina, that he was in part responsible for the poor conditions of the peasants, the fact that their rations had gone down, that life was more difficult than ever, and then in some parts of Russia large numbers of people faced starvation. They began to attach Rasputin to the Tsar as well, to the whole system. The Tsarina favored Rasputin because he had a power to help the crown prince, Alexei. Alexei had a genetic disease, hemophilia type B. Genetic diseases produced by inbreeding among royalty have had a huge effect on political history in Europe. You have very small numbers of families intermarrying with one another. They could not marry commoners. They needed to marry within other aristocratic circles to secure alliances, to secure land claims, etc. The problem is that that's a very shallow gene pool, and genetic problems began to surface due to this shallow gene pool, due to this inbreeding. And one of those is that the Crown Prince Alexei had developed hemophilia. And in hemophilia, the problem is that if you're cut, your blood can't clot on its own very easily. So what would happen is she searched for healers, for doctors all over Europe to try to save her son's life, to prevent him from dying from hemophilia, because just a common injury, childhood injury, could kill him. Rasputin was able to stop the bleeding. They speculate that he may have been able to stop the bleeding by hypnotism. He was a master hypnotist, and by reducing the stress of the boy, he was able to bring actually cause the blood to clot, to remove some of the pressure on the boy, and his health would improve. So the fact that he could help Alexei, that meant that the Tsarina put enormous amounts of trust in him, almost kind of idol worship, because she was desperate to save her son. Rasputin could do so, so she began to, in her husband's absence, promote him at events, to push the idea that he had these magical powers. And of course, genetic diseases created by aristocratic inbreeding has affected much more than just the history of Russia. For example, this illness that I've been dealing with, which I will talk about in a different lecture very briefly, was also produced by the same kind of aristocratic inbreeding centuries ago. So it has a huge effect on my own life. It would be nice if I, had some of this wealth to go with it. Unfortunately, that's not the case. But yeah, it has a huge effect, and genetic diseases have a huge effect on all of us. But I'll talk more about that in a different lecture. There was chaos in Russia. People began to call for political change, and the shape that that change would take was a matter of serious contention. You had those who wanted a form of liberal democracy, where there was a free market economy, where people voted in elections, etc. And then you had one group, the communists, who argued for a radical redistribution of land. And of course, unlike in, say, the United States, where many people own land, where the percentage of landowners, people who own their own homes, etc., is much higher than in many other societies. This is a society where the vast majority of people were landless peasants, dependent upon the aristocrats for their survival. And so communism was very attractive to these starving people. And you'll find that when you look throughout the 20th century, that the worse people's conditions are, the more they are likely to favor extreme ideologies like communism. The communists overthrew the Tsar. They had the Tsar and his entire family executed. They won the civil war that followed the end of the Russian Revolution. They signed a treaty with Germany, taking Russia out of the First World War. And you can see in this image here, Comrade Lenin will cleanse the world of filth. He's sweeping away all of the hated anti-communist figures. There's the German Kaiser up at the top, the Russian Tsar beneath him, this capitalist banker here. This is a symbol of the United States. And then over here on the left, there is a Russian Orthodox priest. Looks a lot like Rasputin. So he's sweeping all of that away, building a new society where people are going to be taken care of, where there's not going to be famine, where there's not going to be war, etc., etc. Remember when we talked about communism, the utopian vision. This is what Lenin wants to enact. So Lenin came to power by 1918, he had taken the Soviet Union, the new Soviet Union, out of the war against Germany. So Germany was then able to push all of its forces against the Allies in the West. Unfortunately for Germany, the United States entered the war and prevented this last push. The Soviet Union had stabilized itself under Lenin, but the Soviet Union really became an international force to be reckoned with under a dictator named Joseph Stalin. Stalin is one of the most important people in the 20th century. He's one of the most evil people in the 20th century. and he is one of the most destructive people in the 20th century. He's on par with Hitler. He actually caused the deaths of more people than Hitler, but he is in many ways very, very similar to Hitler. They have an almost identical personality in some regards. They're very different in others. But one thing that I like to do is having my master's degree is in anthropology, I like to look back at the figures in the past and do psychoanalysis, or at least read other people's attempts at psychoanalysis, those with a huge psychology background. And many people have argued that Joseph Stalin, like Hitler, like Mao, like many of these other dictators, that they suffered from narcissistic personality disorder, meaning that they had their personality, their characters were flawed irreparably due to the fact that they were internally empty. They had no sense of self due to abuse, due to neglect, due to a traumatic childhood. They had no confidence. They had no inner peace. They could never achieve an internal equilibrium. So what they wanted to do is then they needed to seek adulation, to seek control, seek power, and this was a way of making up for this absence of a true self. Another condition of narcissistic personality disorder is a lack of empathy for other people. And being able to sense that another person is in pain, to feel bad because another person is in pain, and then to want to do something about it. Stalin said that when one man is killed, it's a tragedy. When 1 million men die, that's a statistic. Okay, that shows the callousness of Stalin. Stalin used people as instruments. When he grew tired of them, he would have them eradicated. Not because he truly feared them. He feared them slightly. He feared other people to depending on how much power they had, because he had literally no problems ordering the deaths of another person, even someone who was very close to him, seemingly, who had helped him for many years. Had no problem with that, because he didn't see other people as truly human. And this is a psychological problem that he had, and it's a similar issue with Hitler. You know, you look at Hitler, you see in these, I'll tell the story about my granddad. And my granddad, when he went through the concentration camp at Dachau, he and some of the other soldiers, he had saw this one soldier. There was a soldier from New York City. He was of Polish ancestry, and he was so tight with my granddad. They were tight even well after the war. They didn't lose touch. They would write letters to one another, and it seems like they wouldn't be very similar. This guy is from New York City, from the ghetto of New York City, and my granddad is this, just Appalachian, just living out in the hills, total hillbilly. You wouldn't think that they would get along, but they did. They did get along. When my granddad saw him, he turned a corner of a building, and he was on his knees, just throwing up and screaming. And this is somebody who had been with him this whole time. They were both paratroopers. They had both, endured the Battle of the Bulge. They had fought their way through France together. And he was like, "What's going on? What's going on?" And then he rushed over, and he saw around the corner. He saw this huge pile of just children under 5 years of age. Their corpses, just completely naked, laid one on top of the other, and there's just this mound of people. And he told me that story. He had never told his children that story. He never told his wife that story. You can imagine why. There was, I guess, some distance in terms of time between me and him, and he told me that before he died, just because I followed him around, idolized him, not thinking at the time just how much suffering he had to have been doing for decades trying to live with that. But, Hitler had no qualms about that. He had no qualms about putting 5-year-olds in ovens. And it's the same kind of thing with Stalin. He had no qualms about sending entire families to Siberia to freeze to death. And this is a characteristic of narcissistic personality disorder. And unfortunately for the rest of us, narcissistic people, by their very condition, desire praise. They seek power. They seek political success. They seek to lead. And that's not to say that all leaders are narcissists. No, not at all. But you have leaders like, for example, John F. Kennedy, who, despite the fact that they're part of this cult of personality, they don't have journalists thrown in jail. They don't attempt to use dirty tactics to silence critics. There's a speech by John F. Kennedy that we're going to look at in the Cold War section that shows an example of Kennedy attempting to curb actually the power of the federal government, which is something Stalin or Hitler would never have done. One thing that Stalin did is keep in mind that this is the true effect of communism. Communism purports to empower people by making them equal. What communists don't understand is that by taking away people's private property, you make all people equally expendable and equally powerless. So, previously, while you had massive amounts of inequality in Russia, most people were living on the land with which they could grow their own food. When the Soviet government took control of the food supply, and this is the same thing that happened in North Korea in the 1990s, and it happened in China in the 1960s, the government then has the ability to dispensate that food to those who support it. So in regions like the Ukraine, or like the far northeastern portion of North Korea on the North Korea-China border, there are regions which are less enthusiastic about a particular regime. Well, you can silence their dissent, crush them, prevent their threat by forcibly starving them to death. And that's what Stalin did, that's what Mao did, that's what Kim Jong-il did in the 1990s. Starving people to death because they had the ability to, because they controlled the food supply. No American president would ever be able to, despite the fact that the executive office is extremely powerful, would be able to use that tool to destroy dissent. For example, when Bush was in office in 2004, he was reelected. If he had, starved the states that didn't vote for him, or if President Obama in 2012 had starved the states that didn't vote for him, right? The American presidents can't really do that. That's not to say that they don't have tremendous amounts of power, but under the communist system, the government owns all of the private property, and your private property is actually a shield in many ways against this kind of exploitation. And millions of people were killed. In fact, Stalin was so brutal, he did so much damage to the army that when the Germans invaded in 1941, summer of 41, the army lacked leadership and actually had to retreat as a result. He would rather have a weakened military than have officers that weren't keen on his seizing complete control. Another aspect of Stalin's regime is that he was a master of propaganda. He was a master at inserting himself in the mental lives of people, in their emotional lives. He put out these pictures in which children are thankful to Stalin for their toys. As these children age, they'll look back on their childhoods with happiness. They'll look at Stalin with joy. Right? They'll see Stalin as kind of this fixture in their lives. That's why people who had their relatives killed by Kim Il-sung actually wept and cried at his funeral in 1994. Same thing with Kim Jong-il and his funeral recently. So they knew how to, these dictators know how to, they naturally know, because being narcissists, they've been doing this on a small level their entire lives. They know how to worm their way in and get you to do exactly what it is they want. And imagine, think about that friend or significant other or boss or whatever you have in your life who can get you to do these different actions and then somehow make you feel, and they'll ask you to do something you know is wrong. And then when you don't want to do it, they actually make you feel guilty for not wanting to help them, right? And that's that mastery of manipulating other people. That's the narcissist's MO. And of course, Stalin and Hitler, they were masters of this. It was not hard for them to apply this to to the political process. Okay, so at this point I'd like for you to pause this and take a second to think about what we've talked about with narcissistic personality disorder and everything, and take a look at that video of Lisa Ling's documentary from North Korea, where an altruistic doctor from Nepal, an optometrist from Nepal, who, out of the goodness of his heart and with several other equally altruistic backers, traveled to North Korea and did for free eye surgery on 1,000 people. And this is important because the regime, the communist regime, keeps out the international community, and part of that is knowledge. Remember the idea of Japan being under the so-called bamboo curtain, right? The closing of the country, right? That kept out knowledge, and it kept Japan temporarily well behind other nations, technologically speaking, militarily speaking. It's the same kind of thing with medicine, same kind of situation in North Korea. So I'd like for you to take a look at that, and then I'd like for you to just think about that in line with the narcissistic personality disorder. Because what we see in North Korea is an individual, a leadership that has basically tried to replace God. Not just and that's not just in a figurative sense, the way a preacher would use it or something like that, or a rabbi or something like that. I mean, he literally is demanding that he be praised like God. These people are thanking him. They're not thanking the surgeon. They're not thanking medical science. They're not thanking God. They're thanking him for being healed. So take a good look at that, and then we'll resume with talking about the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles is one of the most, if not the most hated international agreements in the history of the world. The Germans absolutely hated this treaty, and for good reason. It was a completely despicable treaty in one sense, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. If you recall, World War I was because of the alliance system. You had all of these countries, Britain, France, trying to protect their overseas colonies, which, from my perspective, holding these colonies was in itself unethical. They wanted to protect their empires from Germany attempting to take their empires, muscle its way in to being like Britain and France. And that's what really led to this war. This wasn't a war for democracy until Woodrow Wilson entered the United States into the war and began to describe it as such. And it couldn't be a war for democracy because one of the key players, Russia, was an autocratic monarchy. So, you know, the idea that it is for some Western values or democracy or freedom, that it was only when the United States entered the war and began to demand that certain principles were put into effect that became part of the equation. Like, for example, Woodrow Wilson believed in self-determination. He believed that all these ethnic minorities in Europe and the Middle East, that they should have the right to form their own nations and elect their own governments. That is an American idea that was not shared in much of Europe at the time, particularly among those more traditional politicians like Winston Churchill, who wanted to keep their empire, etc. But the Germans had to take the full blame, even though everyone knew that the Germans, they shared in the blame, but it wasn't completely their fault. The Germans had to pay reparations, and these reparations would have them paying France in particular, and also Britain, paying them into the 1990s. So essentially Germany would be financially crippled for almost 100 years. The Germans had to limit the size of their armed forces. On top of this, French troops were allowed to occupy parts of German territory, particularly in the Rhineland, in the far west of Germany. When German miners began to strike over conditions, the French troops came in because they were being paid with the proceeds from the mines. The French troops came in and brutalized them. So this is something that the Germans hated. And because this treaty was so hated, they began to look at the people who signed the treaty and say, well, hey, you know, these people are responsible for our misery. And if you remember, at the time, Germany signed the armistice. German troops were still in France. They were being overrun by the Allies, particularly by these fresh American troops that we had already talked about, but they weren't yet in Germany. So the idea was that Germany could have fought on, that Germany could have continued to struggle if not for these vicious politicians stabbing, this is the term, stab in the back, the stab in the back theory. The German politicians stabbed the nation in the back, the army in the back, and because some of these politicians were Jewish, this blame, the Jews themselves began to be scapegoated for this defeat in the First World War. This is what's called the War Guilt Clause, Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles. This is the most hated piece of the entire treaty. The war was premeditated by the Central Powers together with their allies, Turkey and Bulgaria, and was the result of acts deliberately committed in order to make it unavoidable. Germany, in agreement with Austria-Hungary, deliberately worked to defeat all the many conciliatory proposals made by the Entente powers. So basically, it's kind of like, you're back in high schools when people have gotten into a fight, right? I didn't want to hit him. I just, he just kept, it's basically that. That's a microcosm of this idea. Britain and France are saying, well, we didn't want to go to war. We did everything we could to prevent this war. But Germany, man, they just kept on. They just kept on. Austria-Hungary just kept on. We had to finally fight. And, of course, we know that that's not the case. We know that there were not any conciliatory proposals made by the Entente powers. We know that because of this alliance system, these two camps were on a collision course to fighting one another, regardless of what happened. If the Archduke Franz Ferdinand had not been shot, something else would have set this situation off. Because ultimately, there was nowhere left for these militaristic empires to colonize, so they would have turned inward. Because again, you control, the political powers in societies are often very different mentally than many of the ordinary people. Most Germans, French, British people having no desire to colonize the world or make the world, civilize different peoples. They had no concern with all of that kind of ideology. The idea is it is very similar to that in 1914. It was very similar to that of modern Japan. The idea of the country minding its own business, working for the prosperity and peace of everyone who lives there. Of course, that's not how these leaders felt. They wanted to expand their empires, and etc. And that's what led to this alliance system, which led to the war. It wasn't the fault of any one party. The Weimar Republic, the German government that replaced that of the Kaisers after the end of the First World War, had to pay these reparations. And, well, they didn't like it. And of course, why would they? They had to pay massive amounts of reparations that were crippling the economy. So as a big biting their thumb at the Allies, the German government began to print money to pay these reparations. Oh, you want 5 million Deutschmarks? Well, we won't have to worry about budgeting it in. We'll just print it. We'll just print that money, and yes, it will cause inflation, but it's your money. It's not money we're getting to keep anyway. The problem is that while they expected inflation, and this is very chilling for our government today, for any government, in my opinion, and I'll talk more about this in a moment, this is something that we should pay very close attention to. This is, from my perspective, the most important slide in this lecture. It began to spiral out of control, because inflation is like a bucking bronco, right? You can ride on it, and you can tolerate riding on it for a certain amount of time, but ultimately, if you keep going, it's gonna throw you off. It's got to be checked. It's got to be stopped at some point. The Romans, what they did is they reduced the amount of silver in their coinage from about the 3rd century on, because as they had the choice: stop expanding, or continue to expand and pay the military with coins that they had to debase in value. So they would reduce the amount of silver, increase the amount of nickel in coinage. The value of the coinage would go down. And of course, they didn't understand supply and demand when it came to money. They understood it according to other commodities, but not according to money. And they ended up, over about a 300-year period, destroying their currency. Basically destroying the value of the Roman currency, towards, by the end of the empire, they were actually reduced to a barter economy. And ultimately their empire, the western half of the empire, was destroyed. This is a similar thing. 1922, a loaf of bread, a staple food for a German family for a day, cost 122 marks. 1923, a loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. For equivalent, you buy a pack of Brock's jelly beans for $1. In 2015, you pay $1.6 billion a year later. Right? So, in this situation, basically inflation has spiraled out of control and the money is worthless. There's a country right now going through radical hyperinflation. That's Zimbabwe, where you have the typical effects of just irresponsible printing of money. And of course, we're running a deficit in this country. We're running in the red. One of the ideas about getting out of this predicament is called quantitative easing, which is just printing more money through the Federal Reserve to help alleviate this, to get over this debt. And of course, not only is that going to mean, gradually speaking, a lowering of the quality of life for most people, there's the chance of this kind of hyperinflation, because the Germans did not expect this. No one in the German government thought, well, hey, we're going to make our currency completely worthless. But they did. And you can see this young woman here burning these marks in this furnace as fuel. When economies tank, radicalism thrives. So when people are starving, when they're unemployed, when it seems like they're never going to be employed, again, you know, like I stated with the issue with the collapse of the Japanese economy in the last lecture, touching on the same period of time, people begin to radicalize. They're tolerant of more radical solutions. So one of the possibilities that for the German people to embrace in the 1920s is their society was in shambles, literal economic collapse, looking at unemployment, situation. Imagine a situation where you have children to feed and there is zero chance of you ever getting a job. Zero chance. The idea that, you've worked hard, you've gotten this degree, some of you are going to go get master's degrees, whatever. The idea that working at a gas station is all you can ever do with your life. Right? And not to say that that's bad to work at a gas station, but it's not a position that's generally high paying, and generally people don't go to school with that kind of job in mind. But imagine that that's what you're faced with. Okay, that's what German people were going through. This government had no solutions. The currency was destroyed. The economy was in shambles. So one alternative was the communists. Have a communist revolution with the communists in power, redistribute all of the wealth, give all of the private property to the government. And there was an alternative, equally as extreme, but in a different direction. And that was National Socialism. And let's keep in mind, it's socialism, just like with the leftist socialism, but instead of internationalism and an internationalist mentality, there's one based on racial purity. So this politician, Adolf Hitler, had been in the German army. Even though he was born in Austria, he fought for the Germans. He had been in the German army during the First World War. He was gassed. He was temporarily blinded. And so in the 1920s, he hung out with veterans of this war in different beer halls, etc., hanging out, drinking. And many of these veterans had kind of radicalized politics. And so Hitler began to mix with these people, and again, like Stalin, he was a narcissist. So we think of Hitler, we think of the dictator. You have to think of Hitler at this point as just an ordinary man. But still, like ordinary narcissists, millions of them throughout this world, he could manipulate you, he could get you to give him money, he could manipulate women narcissists can manipulate the opposite sex, whether they're male or female, into being in all kinds of abusive relationships, putting up with stuff they would never put up with from someone else. But he gradually built a political party around this idea that the German nation had been stabbed in the back, and the German people wanting revenge. He argued that the way to get out of this economic slump was to arm the country and try for another fight with the Allies to go for it again, to establish their supremacy over the different peoples of Europe. And that ideology was very similar to that pushed in Japan in the 1930s. The Japanese and the Germans were natural allies because each believed that they had a sphere of influence, which was specific to their race. The Japanese believed that the Germans were the Western master race, the Japanese were the Eastern master race. So with the Germans, and people like to say, well, how were the Germans and Japanese allies? They were just using one another. That's not true at all. The Germans sent their research on the atomic bomb they had attempted to develop. They actually sent that in a submarine to Japan after the fall of Berlin, so that the Japanese might be able to still build an atomic weapon and win the war. The Germans believed that they were the master race. Yes, but they didn't. The Nazis did not believe that complete dominion of the entire world was possible. They wanted to rule a united Europe with themselves at the head of it, and they worked actually with different groups throughout the world. If you've ever heard of the Ba'ath Party in Iraq, the party that Saddam Hussein headed, the Ba'ath Party is actually basically the Nazi party for Arabs. The Nazis helped to fund it, helped to promote its growth. The Ba'ath Party would rule the Middle East the same way that the Nazis would rule Europe, and the Japanese would rule Eastern Asia. There's this idea that each ethnic group has its own sphere, right? And just as the Japanese have the right to look for their own ethnic purity, so do the Germans, right? And it's the same kind of thing. So they were actually very similar in the way that they looked at the world. In these pictures, you can see on the left, these are Soviet infantrymen running across a field, the Battle of Kursk in the Ukraine. The Battle of Kursk was the largest tank battle in the war, actually in history. So, it's amazing that these infantrymen, you can imagine how vulnerable. You can see the shell exploding in the distance there. On the right, you can see an image of an Australian commando, 19 years of age, before his beheading. And if you look at this picture was actually found in the pocket of a dead Japanese soldier. A U.S. Marine found this at the Battle of Iwo Jima, and so he turned this into his command, and they were able to identify what happened to this soldier. He had actually been captured and executed. And you can see in the back, you can see the people smiling, particularly the one guy up front. And this is similar kind of, sends a similar kind of chilling image, like with, when you look at being from Mississippi, having taken Mississippi history. You look at these pictures of lynchings, Mississippi and Alabama, 1940s, 1950s, and you see people standing around drinking wine, smoking cigars, they're smiling and laughing, while an innocent person is hanging there from a tree, and it's just very disturbing, almost sickening. It makes you wonder, are these people psychopaths? And again, I think part of that is from growing up in a culture where you're encouraged to view someone else's pain as lesser than yours, as unreal in some way. The Axis, the alliance of Germany, Italy, and Japan, three fascist states, was very successful very early on. The Germans had managed to overrun France due to the fact that the French believed in a forward defense. They basically were expecting a round two for trench warfare. They had developed a series of bunkers and trenches called the Maginot Line. These were designed to make France impregnable to invasion. The problem was that the Germans dropped paratroopers over it and drove tanks around it. The French were not expecting the kind of fast, mechanized war that the Germans had been planning. So they overran France very quickly in 1940. So the French, it's not that the French nation was composed of cowards who just were scared to threw their arms up. It's that the French were completely defeated
in such a complete way so rapidly. It's like putting all of your eggs in one basket and then running it over with a steamroller. What were the French going to be able to do at this point? And the answer is nothing. You know, once the Allies had bypassed this network of trenches and pillboxes and bunkers, the French were totally defenseless. The Italians had managed to occupy Libya, which was a source for petroleum, which the Germans needed with their form of mechanized warfare more than perhaps any other nation, with maybe the Japanese Navy. The Germans also overran Denmark, Norway, and threatened Great Britain. The Allies, during the first phase of the Second World War, were continuously in retreat. Chiang Kai-shek's Republic of China was in retreat, fighting a defensive war against Imperial Japan. France had been occupied by Germany. Britain, even though it maintained this huge empire, Britain was very, very fearful of a possible German invasion. And the Soviet Union, despite its size, its resources, its formidable army, was reeling from political chaos and military indecision due to Stalin's purges of the army and government.
So Lenin came to power by 1918 he had taken the Soviet Union, the new Soviet Union, out of the war against Germany. So Germany was then able to push all of its forces against the Allies in the West. Unfortunately for Germany, the United States entered the war and prevented this last push.
The Soviets. December 7th, 1941, Japanese aircraft launched a surprise attack on the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The goal of this was to destroy the Pacific Fleet so that the Japanese military could rapidly occupy the Philippines, Indonesia, French Indochina, etc. unopposed. The reason for this is that the United States had put an oil embargo on Japan in light of the atrocities committed during its invasion of the Chinese mainland. Well, the Japanese had about 8 months of oil left, and they made the choice that they were going to attack the U.S. Pacific Fleet and take Southeast Asia to get a hold of those oil fields to continue its war against China. Originally, there had been a plan to land soldiers on Oahu. That plan was eventually ruled as unrealistic, that an actual amphibious landing would, that the soldiers would not be able to hold it long enough for any kind of, to have any effect on the war once the fleet was destroyed. So, the Japanese military very quickly overran the British and Filipino garrisons in the Philippines. They defeated the British in Singapore, and a huge British army surrendered to Japan. It was one of the biggest defeats in British history. They very rapidly occupied French Indochina, which is Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. They threatened to invade Australia, and they moved deeper into China. Despite the fact that the German military had occupied much of Western and Eastern Europe, there would eventually be a turning point. And on the Eastern Front of Europe, that turning point was the Battle of Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad was an immense concern for propaganda because it was named after the leader of the Soviet Union, Stalin. So if Stalingrad fell to the Germans, that would be a huge propaganda victory for Hitler. If Stalingrad held, that would be a huge propaganda victory for Stalin. So the Germans attempted to take Stalingrad, besieged the city, bombed it into oblivion, and you can see here in this picture, this is a perfect picture of these gutted out buildings. The reason for this is that the Germans used a type of delayed fuse bomb. They'd drop it from the air, it would crash through the roofs of buildings, and then when it was inside the buildings, only then would it explode. So what this did is it left the frames of the buildings intact and killed everyone inside. Now this was designed to be lethal, to cause terror. It had the unintended consequence of basically creating fortresses. You know, these bombed out buildings were excellent cover for snipers, for guerrilla fighters, for Soviet infantry in general. And because this was a bombed out urban setting, the German tanks were much less useful than infantry. But with that said, the German SS and Wehrmacht infantry were very well trained, but Stalin decided to counter this by human wave, by throwing hundreds of thousands of soldiers into Stalingrad, into this meat grinder. And eventually it did work. It did push the German military back, and the German army then, for the rest of the war, will mount a retreat closer and closer towards Germany. At this time, I'd like for you to take a look at the video I put up. It's from the movie Enemy at the Gates, and it's about a Soviet sniper. You can get a good idea of just how outgunned the Russian soldiers were as they attempted to cross the Volga River into Stalingrad. You can also get an idea of just what was expected of these soldiers by the government. The poor equipment, the fact that they didn't have rifles, that they would be expected to wait until the man in front of them fell and then pick up his rifle and then move forward. And then take note of the commissars. These are communist officials, communist officers who were in charge not in order to provide leadership, but actually to speak propaganda. That was the important role that they played. It was very much part of the communist system. And you can see them shooting deserters. So just go ahead and take a look at that. Okay, so that was the turning point in the Eastern Front. The German military was in full retreat after Stalingrad. It was a very bloody retreat, very costly for both the peoples living in these regions and for both militaries involved, but it was a retreat nonetheless. The German military would be thrown into retreat in the west after the invasion of Normandy in France. The northern province of Normandy was invaded by sea by American, British, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, and some other allied countries' soldiers, landing in a very, very bloody amphibious landing that cost a tremendous amount of lives. And you can see in the clip on Omaha Beach from the Saving Private Ryan clip that I included, just how difficult this warfare was, just how bloody this was, just how many casualties this produced. The idea of this is that after the Americans and British, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, etc. land in France, that will relieve pressure from the Russians in the east. So then the Germans will be attacked from two directions, and of course that's what happened. The Germans ended up counterattacking at the Battle of the Bulge in the Ardennes, but to no avail. Berlin would eventually fall. Hitler, in fact, armed the Hitler Youth. He had 12 and 13-year-olds out there fighting to the death in the city streets to try to prevent the Soviet capture of the city, while he and several of his top aides committed suicide in an underground bunker. You can get an idea of the difficulty of the Normandy invasion by this this picture here of the Point du Hoc, or Point of the Hawk. You can see the bunkers on the grass up here on the plateau. The Second Rangers scaled this sheer cliff. You know, we're looking at over 200 feet of sheer cliffs. They scaled these with grappling hooks, with German soldiers shooting down at them. You know, and how this was achieved, I don't see how it's possible, but it in fact did happen. They made it on top of these cliffs. They entered these bunkers. The German defenders were wiped out, and they managed to, from that point on, to break through into France.
Okay, so at this point I'd like for you to pause this and take a second to think about what we've talked about with narcissistic personality disorder and everything, and take a look at that video of Lisa Ling's documentary from North Korea, where an altruistic doctor from Nepal, an optometrist from Nepal, who, out of the goodness of his heart and with several other equally altruistic backers, traveled to North Korea and did for free eye surgery on 1,000 people. And this is important because the regime, the communist regime, keeps out the international community, and part of that is knowledge. Remember the idea of Japan being under the so-called bamboo curtain, right? The closing of the country, right? That kept out knowledge, and it kept Japan temporarily well behind other nations, technologically speaking, militarily speaking. It's the same kind of thing with medicine, same kind of situation in North Korea. So I'd like for you to take a look at that, and then I'd like for you to just think about that in line with narcissistic personality disorder, because what we see in North Korea is an individual, a leadership that has basically tried to replace God. Not just and that's not just in a figurative sense, the way a preacher would use it, or something like that, or a rabbi, or something like that. I mean, he literally is demanding that.
This is an image of another president who also was the son of a senator. Instead of Connecticut, we're looking at Massachusetts. That's John F. Kennedy. You can see this picture of him on this patrol boat. He served aboard a patrol boat that was destroyed by a Japanese destroyer. He managed to save some of his crewmen in the night, and he ended up with a back injury from this that he would cause him to wear a back brace for much of his life. That would even affect his assassination because of the way he had to move. But again, the reason that I bring this up is that he was the son of a senator. He was one of the nation's elite. By no means anything like an ordinary person, but he still had to serve in this kind of very dangerous, in this kind of dangerous occupation. Just as there were turning points in Europe, there were turning points in the Pacific. One of these is the Battle of Midway in 1942. The Japanese military had hoped to destroy the rebuilt United States Pacific Fleet with a feint attack. They had maneuvered as though they were going to invade Alaska, which made sense. Alaska was full of oil. It was very sparsely populated by Americans. The Japanese military felt that they could occupy the coast of it without too much in terms of casualties. So the idea is that they would make a lunge towards Alaska, and that this would draw part of the American Pacific Fleet away to defend Alaska. The Japanese did some small maneuvers and landed some troops actually in the Aleutian Islands, the only time American soil has been occupied by an enemy since the War of 1812. And so the idea was that this American Pacific Fleet would be drawn off. Half of it would be drawn off, and the other half would be overwhelmed and destroyed by the entire Japanese Navy. The problem for the Japanese was that the U.S. had decoded their coded communications and knew about this plan. So they didn't fall for the feint to Alaska, and they actually descended upon the Japanese Navy in full and destroyed it. It was very costly. The aircraft carriers, destroyers, the Japanese lost in this battle. They would not be able to replace. Same situation with Guadalcanal. This was a battle based on a kind of brutal jungle fighting. the Japanese threw many of their elite infantry into this battle. They would, and this is something that will be important later. They died to a man, and as a result, the Japanese were deprived of a very important asset. This is the end of European dominance of the globe. We talk about this course starts from 1500 to present. Part of that is because it's of the era of the developing global economy. Another is that one civilization has generally been in command. European societies have been militarily, culturally, scientifically, economically dominant from about 1500 on. Increasingly so, reaching a peak in 1914. After 1918, some European traditionalists believed, well, that the old European dominance of the globe can continue. Europeans can establish these massive empires, we can continue to gain colonies, etc. After World War II, those delusions no longer fly at all. Much of Europe is in ruins. Cities are completely destroyed. The Germans have lost 10% of their entire population. The Soviets have lost 13% of their entire population. But unlike with the Germans, the Soviets have the numbers to make up for it. And with Europe in ruins, this civilization has reached the end of its dominance. After this, power will shift to the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union technically is in Eastern Europe, but we really, when we talk about European civilization in the course of this course, we're talking about Western Europe. That portion of Europe's dominance in the world is over in 1945. Also, the carnage of the war, like with the First World War, but even more so, would have an intense effect on the thinking of people coming afterwards. I have a map here of the different camps used in what's called the final solution, or the Holocaust in Germany and Poland. In green, you have concentration camps. These are camps where large numbers of people were housed to engage in slave labor, constructing ammunition, weapons, supplies, etc. Many people were worked to death. Many people were shot on sight, executed for the smallest of crimes. You can see Dachau, I told you right there, it's in southern, maybe in Austria. I can't remember if it's in Germany or Austria, but it's in the far south of the German Reich. But those are camps where people are meant to fulfill they're just being housed with an eye towards taking them to these camps in red: Auschwitz, Belzec, Majdanek, Sobibor, Treblinka, Chelmno. And in these camps, this was where you went to die. You would get off of the train. You would be told to go into a shower to be cleansed, and instead of water, cyanide gas would come out of the faucets, and you would die. So you know, this is horrific. And the United States bombed Germany into oblivion. And if you go to Japan, you'll find that there isn't a region of Japan that somewhere nearby something wasn't bombed in the Second World War. But like the massacre at Nanking that we talked about, the Holocaust in Europe is very different, in my opinion, in the opinion of many people, and certainly in the opinion of people living at the time. The Holocaust and the rape of Nanking, these were not done for a military purpose. The United States bombed Germany and Japan in an attempt to defeat Germany and Japan. The peoples put into these concentration camps were not at war with Hitler. The Chinese who were killed during the rape of Nanking, they had already surrendered to Japan. So there was no military purpose for this kind of carnage. There was no justification based on we were fighting for our survival. Secondly, not only was there no military reason, there was no economic reason. Despite the fact that people produced goods in these camps, it was horribly inefficient and uneconomical. This actually drained resources and harmed Germany's war effort. And finally, militarily, the Schutzstaffel, the SS, Hitler's elite infantry, they would spend half their time at the Eastern Front and then half their time guarding these camps. So, you know, Hitler was actually pulling away quality military resources to do this. So, from the outside world's perspective, this is slaughter for its own sake. This isn't something done for a military reason or an economic reason. This is killing people because you want them killed. And of course, this would affect how ideas about nationalism, about ethnicity, about eugenics, everything that people tied into this experience, this event, was changed by the world having to come to terms with what happened here. You can take a look at some of these images, you know, and you can imagine. Again, use personal examples just for the sake of example, but you know, my grandfather trying to live through some of these images stuck in his head. This is an image of another president who also was the son of a senator. Instead of Connecticut, we're looking at Massachusetts. That's John F. Kennedy. This is an image of some Japanese soldiers in, I think it's southeastern China. They're part of what's called a tankette crew. A tankette was kind of a very light-skinned, thinly armored type of armored vehicle that served the Japanese military's purposes in China. The Chinese didn't field a lot of tanks. It would not stand up to a heavy tank produced by any other nation. It wasn't designed to. It was designed to fight against infantry. An infantry fighting vehicle would be more along the lines of, or an armored personnel carrier would be more analogous to this today. But you can see here that these soldiers are eating sugar cane. They're taking a break. They get to eat something sweet. And I put this picture up because it's important to contrast this with that of, say, an American GI who would have some sugar in his rations. There wouldn't be sugar in the Japanese soldiers' rations. There would be a certain amount of rice, and if he was lucky, maybe a pack of dried vegetables. That would be it. He didn't get any coffee. He didn't get any sugar. If he needed something else, he wanted something else, he was expected to forage for it. And this is an example of how the Japanese military expected, in some sense, much more from its soldiery. It expected these soldiers to endure privations. There was certainly very little medical care. This is something that the Japanese officers would argue after the war was over, that, you know, how could we give these American soldiers medical care? We don't do this for our own soldiers. The Japanese soldiers were expected to give of themselves much more than some other militaries required. The United States practiced the strategy of island hopping. The Japanese had occupied a number of Pacific islands, building a defensive ring around the inner Pacific Ocean, around the Japanese home islands. So the American strategy was to hop from island to island, inching closer and closer towards the Japanese home islands, and then eventually invade those Japanese home islands. As the United States neared closer to these home islands, Japanese soldiers began to fight to the last man. Such battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, these are extremely bloody, with Japanese defenders committing suicide, civilians in Okinawa being forced to commit suicide by the Japanese military. And the bombing of Japan was very dangerous. The United States had largely leveled the country, and once Iwo Jima and Okinawa were captured, the United States could, at will, pummel the Japanese main islands. The technique was carpet bombing, which was extremely casualty intensive. It's where you just attempt to flatten as much of the enemy resources as possible, industrial resources, military resources, even just civilian populations, killing thousands upon thousands of people. Again, you know, there's very few parts of Japan actually escaped this unscathed. The United States Army Air Force flattened the country. But it was not without danger. You can see here in this picture of the crew of Waddy's wagon, a B-29. They were shot down in 1945. All of these crew members you see here were killed as a result. As the American forces inched closer towards the Japanese home islands, the Japanese government became more desperate. They eventually they had created something called the Special Attack Corps, which would be nicknamed Kamikaze, which, if you remember from week 3, that Kamikaze, that is a play on the concept of the Kamikaze during the Mongol invasion. Remember, the Mongols wanted to attack Japan. This wind, this typhoon, rose up and destroyed their fleet. The Kamikaze, Kami, divine, Kaze, wind, right? That's what these suicide pilots were, in a spiritual sense. They were the divine wind that would save the nation. So pilots were given very little training. They were given kind of a night of festivities where their community kind of bade them farewell, and then they would board their aircraft the next day. They would aim for an American vessel with a bomb and an extra tank of fuel on it to ensure maximum burst. And they would attempt to aim for an American ship. Many of them were shot down, and so they didn't meet their targets, but many of them were successful and killed large numbers of people. You can see in this image, this is Yukio Araki, here, the young man holding the puppy here. This young man was killed. He's the youngest aviator to ever be killed in war. So this was very bloody and very casualty intensive. As the United States moved closer to the Japanese home islands, the Japanese military became more and more intense regarding its defensive measures. Another aspect, another attempt by the government to kind of turn the nation into a fortress was by arming the female population with weapons. You can see the university students on the right with kind of outdated World War I era rifles. On the left, you can see women wielding yari, which are bamboo. In this instance, it's a yari just as a spear, but bamboo spears. The idea was that they would lie down in the grass when an American GI or Marine was running forward. They would raise up and cause him to impale himself in the groin on these spears, and of course it would mean their deaths, but that would be an American soldier killed or at least taken out of the fight. This famous image, when U.S. Marines hoisted flag on top of Mount Suribachi, there are 5 men pictured. Only 2 of them would survive. After this photo was taken, 3 of them were killed. You can see these U.S. Marines as they're storming Mount Suribachi. They're having to walk by their fallen comrades. This is an extremely bloody, vicious fight at Iwo Jima. The Japanese didn't meet the defenders on the beach. Instead, they retreated into the interior of the mountain, in which they built pillboxes and fortified caves, and U.S. troops with flamethrowers had to come in and burn them out. And of course, if a flamethrower, if the tank of the flamethrower is hit, that will cause an explosion, killing people around the flamethrower. So it's very dangerous, and this was an extremely brutal battle in terms of all of history. I'll give you the mentality of the Japanese military at the time by quoting this man here. It's Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, and he wasn't a bad man in the sense that he he was evil or anything like that. He was like most people of most societies of his time. He had an intense devotion to the military he served in and to his nation. But one thing that's different is that this notion of fighting to the last man, of refusing to surrender, that aspect of Bushido, right? If you remember Bushido, of it being shameful to surrender. This is something that has shaped the psychological state of these officers. And so he stated, even though the Allies had outflanked his fleet, and his fleet was basically rendered irrelevant due to the outbreak of the war, he said, "I will break into Leyte Gulf and fight to the last man. Would it not be shameful to have the fleet remaining intact while our nation perishes?" Inching closer to the Japanese main islands, military planners created Operation Downfall. This was the planned invasion of Japan. You can see in these quotes here, the one quote that I will use, "If we once land on one of the main islands and begin a forceful occupation of Japan, we shall probably have cast the die of last-ditch resistance. The Japanese are highly patriotic and certainly susceptible to calls for fanatical resistance to repel an invasion. Once started an actual invasion, we shall, in my opinion, have to go through with an even more bitter finish fight than in Germany. We shall incur the losses incident to such a war, and we shall have to leave the Japanese islands even more thoroughly destroyed than was the case with Germany. This would be due to both the difference in the Japanese and German personal character and the differences in the size and character of the terrain through which the operations would take place. The Japanese islands are volcanic islands. They're very mountainous. Japan is a very mountainous country. That's one of the problems that it's faced throughout history. There's very little arable land due to the fact that it is so mountainous. But Operation Olympic, which would attack the southern third of Kyushu, and then Operation Coronet, which would attack the Kanto Plain, the area of Tokyo. Basically, that's the equivalent of the Northeast Corridor in the United States. Now, this would be very, very, very destructive. It's a possibility that had this invasion occurred, this statistic here, in other words, we shall probably have to kill at least 5 to 10 million Japanese. This might cost us between 1.7 and 4 million casualties, including between 400,000 and 800,000 killed. The United States got around this by dropping 2 atomic weapons, the first on August 6th, the second on August 9th. And one aspect of this to me that definitely justifies using the atomic weapons was the fact that the military officers in the Japanese cabinet still refused to surrender after the dropping of the second atomic bomb. It was only because the emperor at the time, Showa, also called Hirohito, had managed to escape their clutches. He got on the radio and he broadcast the surrender against their wishes. If they had been able to maintain control of him, that statement would not have been made. That is in and of itself evidence of the mentality at the time and of the necessity of these weapons. And if we look at statistics, we look at how many people were killed, we can see a difference. For example, if you look at a little boy in Hiroshima, looking at 90,000 people killed by the atom bomb. The Battle of Okinawa, looking at over that number of Japanese soldiers killed, fighting to the death. At Iwo Jima, we're looking at 22,000 killed. We're looking at 24,000 killed with 5,000 suicides in Saipan. Every major battle of the Pacific War from 1943 on, the Japanese defenders experienced a 95% or greater killed in action rate. Fat Man destroyed 75,000. And in 2 days of conventional firebombing in Tokyo, around 100,000 civilians were killed in 1945. So these weapons were not necessarily that much more destructive than other means of fighting. But the fact that it was just one bomb, that did this damage, and did it in such a new way. The nature of the bomb is what is called into question, is what makes this different for people at the time and afterwards. On the left, you have a shadow of an incinerated person. This was imprinted on the wall of a building at Hiroshima. How an atomic bomb can carve a human shadow into a wall, I don't understand the physics behind that. I'm not going to even attempt to explain it, but it's a true, authentic picture as far as I understand. On the right, you have an image of a Japanese soldier holding a severed head. There are thousands of not thousands. There are several hundred images from the Rape of Nanking, some of which are similar to this, some of which are extremely disgusting. Images of newborns being roasted on bayonets. It's just crazy. It's very disturbing. I didn't include some of the more disgusting images out of concern for just not wanting to look at it. But we have to ask this question. During the 20th century, we reached this point in 1945. From many people's perspectives, all of this progress has occurred from 1500 up until this point in 1945. There's been a lot of improvement in human life, certainly technologically. Many more people around the world are surviving to a healthy age now, in 1945 and now. But we also have to ask the question, are we, morally speaking, are we better people than, as human beings, are we better now than we were then? And of course, this is these events in the middle of the 20th century call that into question. Right? That's something that we need to think about, whether or not we're ethically better than those who came before us or not. Whether we're subject to the same limits, the same laws of human nature, whether we're subject to the same pressures and failures as the people who came before us. Whether or not we can look back on the past and judge people if we're good enough to judge them in that sense. So it's something to think about, and your answer can be yes or no. But this certainly very negative event, the Second World War, that's something that should be part of that measurement. We have scientific discoveries going on at the same period of time. The Green Revolution coming not long afterwards, in which genetically modified crops would enable millions of people to survive who would not have been able to survive previously. So there are definite boons to life in the 20th century. There are definite advances, and there's definite progress. But you also have something like this to contend with, and not just the same old fallible human nature. Technology has enabled that human nature, that fallible human nature, like in the picture on the left. So it's just something to think about, and something that I'd like to leave you with at the end of this lecture.